The candlelight is low tonight, and the corridors are quiet. The court has long since retired, gowns hung, goblets emptied, secrets sealed behind velvet drapes. But you're still awake, aren't you? Good, because now we can begin. Tonight, I'll tell you the story of Anne Boleyn, a woman who was never meant to be queen and yet carved her name into history with little more than wit, silk, and a dangerously well-timed smile. She wasn't the most beautiful, she wasn't the most obedient, but she was the most unforgettable. This is not just a love story. It's a story of seduction, ambition, and quiet ruin, of a girl who learned early that power often speaks in a whisper, and that sometimes the most dangerous weapon at court is not a sword, but a glance. Let your breath slow, let your mind drift, and come with me now, back to the Tudor court where every step was a performance, every kiss could be betrayal, and one woman's refusal would bring down a queen. This is the very scandalous story of Anne Boleyn. Sleep if you'd like, but keep one eye open. Anne never closed both. She wasn't supposed to be the important one. Anne Boleyn was the second daughter. Clever, yes, but not exceptional. She was not the beauty of the family. That title had belonged to her sister Mary, with her soft voice and golden curls, and the kind of face that pleased men without threatening them. Anne had different gifts, sharper ones. She had a mind that moved too quickly, a tongue that could turn admiration into discomfort. She asked too many questions. She looked too long. So they sent her away to France, where women like her were not punished for being dangerous. They were rewarded for it. And Anne, barely more than a girl, but already watching the world like she meant to master it, paid close attention. Her journey began not in Paris, but in the Low Countries, at the court of Margaret of Austria. A brief posting, and a fortunate one. Margaret was shrewd, diplomatic, deeply cultured. Under her roof, Anne was taught languages, etiquette, needlework, the usual fare for a girl of respectable birth. But it was in France that Anne began to become someone else. She arrived in 1514, placed in the household of Queen Claude, the shy, devout wife of King Francis I. Claude herself was quiet, no threat, no scandal. But her court? That was something else entirely. There, Anne found herself surrounded by elegance that didn't whisper. It shimmered. Jewels flashed at throats. Corsets were tight, and laughter tighter. Women played the game of power with fans and glances, with the tilt of a wrist, with the length of a pause between sentences. It was a world of subtle warfare, and Anne, dark-eyed, watchful, and far too clever for her age, studied it like scripture. She was not a beauty by traditional standards, not in France, not in England. Her colouring was too rich, her features too pointed. Her skin carried the olive tones of her mother's Howard blood. Her eyes, nearly black, made people uncomfortable. Anne knew this. She did not care. If she could not charm by softness, she would charm by mystery. She watched how the other ladies in waiting spoke, how they flirted, lied, whispered. She mimicked the way they entered a room, never too quickly, never with purpose. The way their silks trailed behind them like afterthoughts, the way they touched their own necks when they wanted to be noticed. Anne was not pretty. She was compelling. Years passed. She danced, served, observed. She learned French, not just the words, but the attitude. She spoke with elegance, with pause. She dressed with care, favouring rich jewel tones, fabrics that clung, sleeves that draped like falling water. She painted with restraint. Her scent, orange blossom lightly worn, was intentional. Nothing about her was accidental, and when she was sent back to England in 1522, she returned changed. Not outwardly, perhaps, but inwardly she was no longer the second daughter of a moderately ambitious family. She was something else now, something more dangerous. She stepped off the ship as if the air were watching her, as if the land itself should feel lucky she had returned. Her first role at the English court was quiet. She was placed in the household of Queen Catherine of Aragon, pious, noble, kind, a Spanish-born queen who had spent 2 decades trying to give England an heir. Anne served her without complaint. She folded linens, poured wine, said her prayers. But all the while she was listening. The English court was slower than the French. The colours were paler, the flirtations less artful. Everything seemed a little too easy to read. But Anne had been raised now in a place where smiles were weapons and stillness was strategy. She bided her time. Let them think her quiet. Let them think her harmless. There was a flirtation early on. A young nobleman named Henry Percy, heir to the Northumberland title. He was handsome, if a little serious. Earnest in the way men are when they believe women should be flattered by mere attention. He fell quickly. Anne let him. They spoke in chapel, passed notes. There were murmurs of betrothal, but the match was too ambitious for both of them. Percy's father disapproved. Cardinal Wolsey, the king's most powerful minister, intervened. The engagement was quietly dismantled. Anne was humiliated. And very quietly she took note of who had ruined her chances. She would not forget. But she did not unravel. Anne was not the kind of woman who broke when plans failed. She was the kind who rewrote them. The Percy scandal faded. She returned to court, rejoined Catherine's household, lowered her voice, paid attention. And then one day, King Henry began to notice her. It started with glances, not lustful at first, curious. Too long to be accidental, too short to be actionable. Anne, of course, ignored them. Not coldly, just indifferently. That alone was enough to drive him mad. He was a king, after all. He was used to being adored. He wasn't used to being dismissed, especially not by a woman with a reputation for ambition. Anne knew exactly what she was doing. She adjusted her posture. She wore her gowns just a little more fitted than before. She took up reading in the gardens, where the king's hunting parties might pass. She danced with other men at court, laughing too easily, staying just long enough to be seen, but never so long as to appear available. She did not flirt with him. She let him watch. Then came the first letter. It was clumsy, formal, and entirely too sentimental. She waited 3 days before responding. And when she did, she thanked him politely, offered him a token of favour, a glove perhaps, and nothing more. The court was beginning to whisper. Anne Boleyn was clever, too clever. She had refused the king's gift, refused his invitation, refused to blush like a good girl should. They said she was cold. Anne let them talk. She was never interested in being liked, only in being wanted. Henry pursued her. The gifts became grander, the letters more desperate. He begged, he flattered, he promised her everything. Anne answered with restraint. She would not be his mistress. That road had already been walked. By her sister, no less. It led nowhere. Anne wasn't here to be used. She was here to rule. And somewhere behind her pleasant smiles and perfect curtsies, behind the embroidered hems and prayer book hands, the shape of a crown began to form, not yet real, but waiting. Desire, once summoned, rarely disappears quietly, and at court, where nothing was ever said plainly but everything was communicated, through sleeves, through silence, through where one stood and how long one lingered, desire was not a matter of privacy, it was performance. Anne understood this better than anyone. She had seen it in France, how a glance across a supper table could be more indecent than any touch, how laughter behind a fan could collapse reputations. And now, back in England, with the king's attention drifting steadily her way, she saw that power and desire were not only linked, they were inseparable. She was not Henry's mistress, not yet, not ever, if she could help it. And that was exactly why he wanted her. By now, the letters were coming more frequently. They were messy, impassioned, filled with contradictions. One day he wrote of God's plan and her virtue, the next of dreams too explicit for the page. He begged her to return his affections, to see how sincerely he burned for her, how she had bewitched his every thought. He offered her rooms, titles, protection, anything she asked, except marriage. That, of course, was still unthinkable. He already had a wife. Anne read his letters with a careful, measured detachment. She always waited before responding, often several days. She never allowed her replies to be rushed. When she answered, her words were warm but not yielding, witty, gracious, flattering, but never too personal, never explicit, never enough. She made sure he was always left unsatisfied. Which was exactly the point. Court began to shift around her, slowly at first. The Queen's women grew cooler. Her rivals became more attentive, more observant. Everyone wanted to know what Anne Boleyn would do, and more dangerously, what she wouldn't. Henry followed her with his eyes. At feasts he watched her dance with other men, his knuckles whitening around his goblet. She would laugh, not too loudly, just enough, and let her hand rest on the arm of a young courtier, a breath longer than necessary. But when Henry came near, she kept her distance. She curtsied, she smiled, she spoke with reverence, and then she stepped away, not rudely, never rudely, but with the unmistakable message that she would not be easy. The court called it pride. Anne called it strategy. He invited her to his private lodgings. She declined, twice. When he sent her a jewelled brooch, diamonds shaped into the letters H and A, knotted together in gold, she wore it to chapel, openly, over her heart. She knew exactly what she was doing. She gave him nothing, except the thrill of being denied. And still he wrote, more desperate now, more intimate. In one letter he said he was undone by the thought of her hair, unpinned and loose. In another, he asked her to send him something of hers, something she had worn close to her skin. Anne sent him a sleeve, torn from her gown, still warm. She never mentioned it again. Every move she made was deliberate. She kept her conversations light, flirtatious, never vulgar. She let men speak to her and corrected them only when it suited her. She surrounded herself with poets, musicians and scholars, men who admired her mind as well as her body. She praised reformers, discussed scripture, quoted Erasmus. She allowed herself to be unpredictable. She made herself necessary. Not just to the king, but to his court. And yet, for all her control, Anne could feel the danger sharpening around her. The Queen was still in place. Catherine, quiet, devout, increasingly sidelined, remained a symbol of dignity, even as her power slipped through her fingers. but her silence had weight. Her presence in the room could still the air. Anne could feel it, that watchful gravity, that unspoken threat. There were moments when their eyes met across the tapestry-hung halls of Greenwich or Hampton, moments when Anne thought, just briefly, that Catherine might speak, might accuse, might claim what was still, technically, hers. But Catherine said nothing. She simply endured, which Anne was beginning to learn was its own kind of power. Henry, on the other hand, was less composed. His desire grew volatile. He could not hide it anymore. Not from the court, not from the council, not even from the Queen. He was no longer content to play the game in private. He began speaking openly of annulment, telling his closest advisers that his marriage to Catherine had never been valid, that she had been his brother's widow, that God had closed her womb in punishment. He summoned theologians, wrote treatises, consulted scripture. Everything now was justification. And Anne, always careful, always cautious, let him come to the conclusion himself that she was not a mistress, she was a calling. She was not temptation, she was destiny. He told her he wanted her, completely. She told him he could not have her, not while he was married, and certainly not until she was crowned. The reaction was as predictable as it was gratifying. Henry doubled his efforts, new gowns, a title for her father, properties, honour after honour bestowed upon the Boleyn family. Anne's sister Mary, who had once warmed the king's bed and been quietly discarded, now watched as her younger sister did what she could not by seduction, but by refusal. The whispers at court grew louder. She has him by the throat. He's losing his mind. She's no better than the rest, just better at hiding it. Anne ignored them all, let them think what they liked. She was not there to be liked. She was there to win. And yet, there were moments, quiet ones, when the weight of it pressed against her. Late at night, alone in her chambers, she would read Henry's latest letter, still damp with ink, smelling faintly of candle smoke and cedar oil, and feel the pull of it, the ache behind his words, the intimacy, the sheer, relentless hunger of a man not used to being told no. Sometimes she felt it too, a heat behind the ribcage. But she reminded herself, feelings were not a plan. Desire was not a crown, and Anne Boleyn had no intention of being forgotten. She would not be like the others. She would not fade. She would rise, or she would burn. There would be no middle ground. She pressed her hand against the cool glass of her window. Below, the courtyard glowed with torchlight. Somewhere in the hall a lute played. Her name, she knew, was being whispered in rooms she had not entered. Not as a woman, but as a problem. And soon those whispers would reach the Queen's ears, if they hadn't already. The game had changed. The Queen must fall. By the spring of 1528, Anne Boleyn had become a problem that could no longer be contained behind curtains and courtesies. She was no longer a curiosity, no longer simply the clever girl who said no when every other woman said yes. She was now the woman the king could not live without, and the one the Queen could no longer ignore. The palace halls buzzed with speculation. The king's annulment, once an unspoken thought, had become his daily obsession. And wherever he went, from chapel to council chamber, her name was not far behind it. Anne. She was no longer merely desired, she was implicated. And Catherine, for all her piety, all her silence, all her Spanish dignity had finally begun to speak. Anne saw the shift. She noticed it in the way the Queen watched her now, directly, openly, in the way Catherine's ladies grew sharper at the edges, no longer cold, no longer dismissive, but defensive. And Anne? Anne took her place beside it all with the calm assurance of someone who knew she had the upper hand. Because she did. Henry had grown consumed, not just by her body, which even now she kept from him, but by the idea of her as a wife, a partner, the mother of his future son, the woman who, by divine design, would rescue his lineage and his soul. Anne had planted that idea carefully, and now it bloomed without needing her to water it. The Queen, of course, had history on her side. She had been at Henry's side for nearly 2 decades. She was his lawful wife, his Spanish alliance, the woman he had once pursued with as much passion as he now pursued Anne. She had endured miscarriages, stillbirths, the heartbreak of too many prayers left unanswered. She had given him a daughter, and nothing more. But she had also given him loyalty, obedience, faith. She believed, as many did, that she was his one true wife, and that no woman, no matter how witty or desirable, could change what God had joined. Anne knew better. Henry was losing patience with the church, with Catherine, with the delay. He had petitioned Rome for an annulment, citing Leviticus, claiming that his marriage had been cursed from the beginning, that Catherine, once married to his brother Arthur, had come to him impure, and thus God had closed her womb. It was, of course, a legal fiction. But Henry was a man accustomed to getting what he wanted, and Anne had become the thing he wanted most. Their correspondence had grown heavier, longer, more fevered. He called her his beloved, his sole desire, his only comfort in a world that refused to understand them. He swore she had shown him the truth. And Anne, in return, remained just out of reach. She wrote back, yes, and her letters were affectionate, tender even, but never explicit, never compromising, and certainly never yielding. If he wanted her, he would have to give her everything. No more promises, no more chambers, a crown, or nothing. By now she no longer played the coquette. There was no need. Her place at court had shifted. She was seated closer to the king, given her own apartments. Her family, the Boleyns, the Howards, had risen in status, their fortunes growing with every passing week. Anne walked the corridors with quiet confidence, always with purpose. She wore richer fabrics, darker jewels. She allowed her hair to fall in loose waves beneath her French hoods, the barest hint of her collarbone visible when she leaned too far forward at dinner table. Every glance was intentional, every movement calculated. But Catherine, still queen, still proud, refused to step aside. She begged Henry to see reason. She wept before him. She reminded him of their vows, their years together, the child they still shared. She wrote to Rome. She called upon her nephew, Emperor Charles V, to defend her. She refused to leave, refused to be humiliated, and with every refusal, Anne grew stronger. Because the longer Catherine held on, the more Henry resented her. The more impossible the situation became, the more necessary Anne began to seem. Anne never gloated, not in public, but behind closed doors, in whispered conversations with her brother George, in late-night murmurs with her closest ladies, she allowed herself moments of satisfaction. She had waited years. She had played her hand slowly, precisely. And now the Queen was losing. Still, she was careful. She knew how quickly power could shift. One scandal, one mistake, one careless moment, and she would be the villain, the whore, the downfall of England. So she remained chaste, untouched, untouchable. She let Henry press her hand when no one was looking, let him brush too close when they passed each other in galleries, let his voice drop when he whispered her name, his voice hoarse with longing and frustration. But she always pulled away first. The people too had begun to notice. Whispers became louder. Anne Boleyn is bewitching the king. Anne Boleyn will be our next queen. God help us all. Some hated her. Some admired her. Most feared her. She was the wedge in a royal marriage. The woman who made the king defy the Pope. The woman for whom kingdoms were being reshaped. Anne smiled through it all, because what they didn't understand was this. She was not just fighting for love. She was not even fighting for power. She was fighting for a place in history. And then the fever struck. Sweating sickness. A plague that arrived swiftly and without warning, that left the afflicted burning and broken within hours, that knew no class, no title, no virtue. It spread through the court like fire. And Anne, terrified, vulnerable, suddenly mortal, fled. Henry, too, panicked. He sent physicians, letters, prayers. He wrote to her every day, his tone frantic. He told her how he ached for her, how he feared for her, how he couldn't bear to lose her now. Anne survived. Many didn't. But when she returned to court weeks later, pale, quieter, thinner, something had changed. She no longer played the game with the same lightness. Now she moved with purpose, because she had felt death brush her cheek. And now, more than ever, she was certain. She would not leave this world as someone's nearly. She would leave it as queen. Anne returned to court, like a woman who had seen the other side of death. Gone were the easy flirtations, the careful detachment. Anne Boleyn re-entered Henry's world quieter, leaner, and far more dangerous than before. The sickness had passed, but it had not left her untouched. If anything, it had sharpened her. She had seen how quickly everything could be lost, how even kings could panic, how desire could unravel in a single night. So she decided no more delays. It was time to finish what she had started. Henry had changed too. While she was away, the court had feared her dead. The women had whispered prayers, and the men, some quietly eager to see her gone, had begun preparing for what came next. But when she survived, it was as though the king had been given permission to want her more openly. He no longer bothered with subtlety. No more letters folded in secrecy, no more glances stolen behind goblets. Now he stood beside her in the great halls, his hand at the small of her back, his voice lowered only for her. He hosted feasts in her honour, gave her estates, paraded her before the court like a queen in all but name. And Anne, draped in sapphire and crimson, her chin lifted, her smile deliberate, accepted it all with the composure of a woman who had earned it. The court was divided. Some bowed to her, others refused. The old families, the nobles who had once dismissed her as a Boleyn nobody, now watched her with tight mouths and careful words. The Queen's allies glared at her across the chapel, but they could not stop what was coming, because Anne was no longer simply desired. She was defended, and more importantly, she was named. The king had begun calling her his wife, not in secret, not behind the Queen's back, but in council, in conversation, in writing. He had made up his mind. Catherine, still queen-in-law, if not in reality, had exhausted every path available to her. She had written to the Pope, pleaded with Rome, refused to concede that her marriage had ever been invalid, but it didn't matter anymore. Rome delayed, Henry raged, and Anne watched. Anne did not gloat, not publicly, but she did not soften either. She walked past the Queen in silence. She took her seat with perfect posture. She spoke when spoken to, and when she spoke, people listened. Because now Anne wasn't simply Henry's love, she was his cause. And then, quietly, almost anticlimactically, Catherine was removed from court, sent away under the guise of health, dignity, peace, a queen unseated without a formal decree, stripped of her title, her household broken apart. It was not violent, it was not loud, but it was final. Anne said nothing. She didn't need to. The entire court could feel the shift. Henry had chosen her. And whether anyone liked it or not, Anne Boleyn was now the centre of gravity at court. The people were less pleased. In London, crowds gathered. Catherine had been their queen for 20 years. Spanish-born, yes, but virtuous, charitable, constant. Anne, by contrast, was the symbol of change, foreign in spirit, unapologetically ambitious, too clever, too Protestant, too bold, too much. And so they called her names, threw stones at her barge, painted her as a seductress, a usurper, a witch. Anne kept her chin high. She had been underestimated before. She would not be again. In private, Henry reassured her, called her his rightful wife, promised that God had sent her to him, that they would be married soon, that the church would follow him, or be torn down trying. And Anne, with bare feet tucked beneath her silk skirts, listened. She let him speak of destiny, of sons, of heaven's will. And when he said he could not wait any longer, she looked him in the eye and said, "Then don't." Everything moved quickly after that. Anne was pregnant within weeks. Her belly, not yet visible, became the crown she wore most proudly. There was no going back now. The wedding was announced, quietly at first, then formally. The Archbishop of Canterbury, recently appointed by the King, declared Henry's marriage to Catherine null and void. Anne was now, by the law of the King's own court, his one true wife. She had done it. She had risen from lady-in-waiting to Queen of England, not by yielding, not by seduction alone, but by knowing exactly when to say no. And yet, as she stood in her new chambers, larger, grander, fitted with fresh tapestries and thick with roses, Anne felt the walls close just slightly. The game was over, but the crown came with a cost. She had won, but now she had something to lose. For all that Anne had imagined it, and she had, in vivid, breathless detail, nothing quite prepared her for the moment they placed the crown upon her head. It was heavy. Not metaphorically, though that too, certainly, but literally. The Tudor crown, repurposed from St. Edward's regalia, was thick with gold and rubies. It pressed into her skull with all the weight of expectation, of danger, of victory hard won and already slipping between her fingers. But Anne kept her head high, because whatever else they might say, and they would say plenty, she had earned it. It was June of 1533. Anne Boleyn, the mistress turned marquis turned queen, was crowned in Westminster Abbey in a ceremony that dripped with defiance. Never before had a queen consort been anointed with holy oil on the head, a sacred gesture reserved only for kings, but Henry insisted. She was not merely his wife, she was his divine choice, his destiny. His triumph over Rome, over his past, over the laws that had once bound him, and Anne, radiant, proud, and visibly pregnant beneath layers of crimson velvet, walked through London with a procession designed to shock, to provoke, to announce her arrival with absolute, unapologetic grandeur. The crowds were mixed. Some cheered, out of fear or curiosity, or genuine belief that this new queen might bring them the son their king so desperately craved. But others jeered. They hissed from behind alehouse doors, threw fruit, turned their backs. Catherine's shadow still clung to the city. 20 years of loyalty couldn't be erased by jewels and trumpets, but Anne barely flinched. She smiled, slowly, deliberately. A smile that said, yes, I hear you, and no, it doesn't matter, because she had the ring. She had the crown. She had the king. The coronation feast lasted for days. There were swan pies, gilt sugarwork, fountains of wine, music that pulsed through the stone walls like blood. Anne sat beside Henry, her hand on her stomach, her fingers heavy with new jewels, her voice softer than before, but no less sharp. She was gracious, regal, controlled, but behind the scenes, in the withdrawing chambers, the gardens, the candle-lit halls where only whispers were exchanged, the mood was shifting. The women at court watched her with veiled disdain. Some smiled too much. Some avoided her entirely. Few offered true loyalty. Because now, she wasn't just Anne Boleyn. She was Queen Anne, and that meant she was a threat to everyone. She tried to hold them. She tried to rule as she had risen, with strategy, with charm, with enough warmth to melt suspicion, and enough fire to keep them afraid. But queenship was not the same as conquest. It was lonelier, colder. And unlike Henry, power had not made her more beloved, only more scrutinized. She had replaced a saintly queen with a sensual one. She had broken the rules, and now she had to prove that it had all been worth it. And more importantly, she had to deliver. The child in her belly became the court's obsession. The astrologers said it would be a boy. Henry's priests, his physicians, his inner circle, all whispered confidently of a male heir. Finally, at last, this, they said, was why God had allowed the break from Rome. Anne played along. She stroked her growing belly with maternal reverence. She spoke sweetly of the little prince. But at night, when the candles were extinguished and the silk was peeled away, she sometimes touched her stomach in silence and wondered what would happen if it wasn't a boy. She didn't say it aloud, not even to her ladies, but the thought lodged behind her ribs like a splinter. Still, she tried to enjoy the power while she had it. She oversaw her household with discipline, rewarded her supporters, ensured that her family remained well placed. She met with ambassadors, read the latest treatises, advised the king, and in private, she remained his favourite, though already there were cracks. His letters, once full of heat and longing, became shorter, less poetic. He still sought her company, yes, but not with the same urgency. There were days when he was distracted, irritable, preoccupied with diplomacy, money, foreign threats, and worse, with memory. Catherine had not disappeared quietly. She was still writing to Rome, still insisting that she was Henry's only lawful wife, still referring to Anne as that woman, never queen. And Mary, Catherine's daughter, now a sullen young woman, refused to acknowledge Anne at all. She would not curtsy, would not write, would not bend. Henry demanded obedience. Anne demanded loyalty. Neither received what they wanted. The pressure grew. Anne could feel it in the way the court held its breath when she entered a room, in the sudden hush when she passed too close, in the exaggerated praise of her ladies, in the widening silence around her. She was still in control, but only just. And then the pains began. It was late summer when she went into labour. The birth was long, quietly difficult. She refused to scream, refused to show fear. And when the child was finally placed in her arms, swaddled and soft and already watched by half the kingdom's expectations, Anne did not cry. She smiled. She thanked God. She whispered the name. Elizabeth. A daughter. The king hid his disappointment as best he could. He hosted christenings, issued announcements, but Anne saw the shift behind his eyes. The weight of it, the failure, the warning. She told herself it didn't matter, that she was still young, that more children would follow, that this was just the beginning. But she also knew she had only bought herself time. Anne Boleyn had won the crown, but now she would have to keep it. And the court, always patient, always watching, was already waiting for her to slip. It started with a silence, not loud, not sudden, just quieter than before. Henry no longer lingered in her chambers as he once had. His letters, once filled with declarations and longing, now came less often, and said less when they did. His eyes, when they met hers across the great hall, held a flicker of distraction. And Anne, sharp as ever, noticed immediately. She did not panic, not at first. She smiled, kissed his cheek, dressed in the colours he liked best. She reminded him, softly, that they were still newlyweds, that she was still young, that more sons would come. But beneath her calm, something cold began to stir. She had risked everything for this crown, and she was not about to lose it without a fight. At court, the atmosphere thickened. The Boleyns, once rising stars, were now seen by many as overreaching. Thomas, her father, now the Earl of Wiltshire, grew quieter in council. Her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, began to distance himself when it suited him. Even her brother George, her dearest ally, had learned to speak more carefully in court. Because power in Tudor England was never permanent, and ambition, once admired, could quickly become a threat. And then came Jane Seymour. She appeared almost quietly, a soft-faced lady-in-waiting, recently placed in Queen Anne's household. She was everything Anne was not. Pale, submissive, silent. She lowered her eyes when spoken to. She laughed only when invited. She wore virtue like a veil. Anne saw through it at once. She knew that look, the look of a woman biding her time. And Henry, of course, noticed her. Anne's second pregnancy ended in tragedy. It was early 1534 when she miscarried, quietly, painfully, in her private chambers. The king was not with her. He arrived later, stiff and silent, and stayed only a few minutes. He said nothing cruel, nothing cold, just nothing at all. Anne clutched her belly long after the bleeding stopped and stared at the ceiling in silence. The silence was louder now, but Anne was not done fighting. She threw herself into her role, more visible than ever, more commanding. She reinforced alliances with reformist clergymen. She read banned books. She funded translations of the New Testament. She played politics in whispers. She tried to become what Henry had once believed she was, his equal. But Henry did not want a partner anymore. He wanted peace, a quiet household, a son. And Anne, fierce, demanding, brilliant, had become a source of pressure, of blame, of guilt. The courtiers, sensing the change, began to shift their loyalty. Thomas Cromwell, once a Boleyn ally, now moved in the shadows. He had little affection for Anne. Her interference in politics had made her a liability. She'd opposed his plans for the monasteries, publicly humiliated him more than once. Their alliance had never been built on trust. Now it was dissolving into quiet enmity, and Cromwell did not lose gracefully. Anne's enemies began to circle. Some whispered that she was cursed, others that she was barren. Some even claimed she had seduced the king with sorcery, that her bewitching charm had been unnatural from the start. And still, she tried. She became pregnant again in 1536. For a time there was hope. Henry was warmer, even affectionate. The court held its breath. The child would secure everything. But then, on the very day Catherine of Aragon's funeral, no less, Anne collapsed and miscarried once more. The child, this time, had been a boy. Henry's grief turned quickly to bitterness. He blamed stress, the arguments, the courtly drama. Her. He said, not kindly, not loudly, that God was punishing him again. Anne, white-faced in her bed, said nothing. But she saw it then, the way he looked at her, as though she were no longer his victory, but his mistake. And as if summoned by the scent of opportunity, Jane Seymour reappeared, more modest than ever. Her hands always folded, her words always measured. She never reached for the king. She simply allowed herself to be pursued. Anne tried to warn him, tried to remind him that Jane was nothing new, that mistresses came and went. But Henry had changed. He didn't want passion anymore. He wanted peace. Behind the scenes, Cromwell moved quickly. He had grown tired of Anne's interference, of her political ambition, of her failure to produce a son. He began gathering whispers, inventing threats, suggesting that the Queen's influence had turned treasonous, that she had seduced others, that her court was full of secrets, that she had committed adultery, perhaps even incest. It was absurd, and Anne knew it, but absurdity in Tudor England was no defence. In early 1536, the rumours became louder. Courtiers who had once bowed low now avoided her eyes. Her music master, her poet, her brother, all men she trusted, all names Cromwell began to circle. Anne felt the shift. She tried to hold Henry's gaze, tried to make him remember the woman he had once risked everything to marry. But he had already begun to look away. Still, she was queen. She reminded herself every morning as her ladies dressed her in crimson and pearl. You are queen. You were crowned. You were chosen. But the halls were quieter now, the candlelight colder. And something was coming. And so the crown sits heavier now. The silk is still warm, the jewels still glitter, but the shadows are lengthening. Anne has climbed higher than any woman before her, from lady-in-waiting to Queen of England. But the winds have shifted, and those who once praised her are sharpening their knives. Enemies whisper in chapel. Allies step back, and somewhere in the quiet, the gallows are being measured. The love that raised her may soon be the reason she falls. But not tonight. Tonight, she still wears the crown. And you, dear listener, have only heard the beginning. Part 2 will take you to the tower, to the trial, to the kiss before the blade. But for now, sleep beneath your velvet, drift off to visions of candlelight and thrones that tremble. Sweet dreams.